The morning mist hung heavy over Buckingham Palace as Senior Royal Guard Captain James Whitmore adjusted his crimson uniform for what he believed would be another routine day. For 15 years he had served the crown with unwavering dedication, his family's military tradition stretching back 4 generations. His great-grandfather had served Queen Victoria, his grandfather King George VI, and his father Queen Elizabeth II. The weight of that legacy pressed upon his shoulders every morning as he donned the iconic bearskin. Captain Whitmore had always prided himself on knowing royal protocol better than most courtiers who spent their days shuffling papers in gilded offices. He had memorized every regulation, every tradition, every subtle nuance of royal hierarchy that had been passed down through centuries of British monarchy. It was this deep knowledge that would soon thrust him into the center of a constitutional crisis that would shake the very foundations of the modern royal family. The trouble began during the morning briefing in the guards' quarters beneath the palace. Lieutenant Sarah Matthews, a sharp-eyed young officer who had recently joined the Queen's Guard, approached Captain Whitmore with a leather-bound book she had discovered in the archives. The book, covered in dust and bearing the royal seal, contained detailed records of royal titles and their legal foundations dating back to the Tudor period. "Sir, I've been researching historical precedents for our new assignments," Lieutenant Matthews said, her voice carrying a note of concern that immediately caught Whitmore's attention. "I found something rather troubling about Queen Camilla's current title." She opened the ancient tome to a page marked with a silk ribbon, pointing to a passage written in elaborate script. Captain Whitmore leaned closer, his experienced eyes scanning the text. What he read made his blood run cold. According to the legal documentation, the title Queen Consort could only be bestowed under specific circumstances that, according to this historical record, had not been properly fulfilled. The regulations stated that certain parliamentary procedures and ecclesiastical endorsements were required before such a title could be legally recognized. As he continued reading, Whitmore discovered that these requirements had been mysteriously overlooked during the recent coronation proceedings. The document suggested that without these proper legal foundations, the title was essentially ceremonial rather than legally binding. More troubling still, it appeared that previous consorts who had attempted to claim the title without proper legal backing had faced serious constitutional challenges. The weight of this discovery settled heavily on Captain Whitmore's shoulders. Here was a man who had sworn an oath to protect not just the physical safety of the royal family, but also the legal integrity of the crown itself. The very foundations of his duty were built upon the principle that the monarchy operated within established legal frameworks that appeared to have been compromised. As word of the discovery began to spread quietly among the guard, Captain Whitmore found himself facing an impossible choice. Should he remain silent and allow what appeared to be a legal irregularity to continue, or should he speak up and risk being branded a troublemaker? The loyal soldier in him wanted to stay quiet, but the constitutional guardian in him knew that silence could be seen as complicity. The situation became even more complicated when Lieutenant Matthews discovered additional documents suggesting that other members of the royal household were aware of the potential legal issues but had chosen to proceed anyway. The implications were staggering. If this was true, it meant that the recent coronation ceremonies had been conducted with full knowledge that certain legal requirements were being bypassed. Captain Whitmore spent that evening walking the palace grounds, the weight of his discovery heavy on his mind. The ancient stones seemed to whisper the stories of centuries of royal tradition that he now feared was being undermined. He thought of his ancestors who had served the crown with honor, and wondered what they would do in his position. The next morning brought no clarity, only more pressure as other members of the guard began asking questions. The discovery had created ripples throughout the ranks, with seasoned officers expressing concerns about their own oaths of loyalty. If the legal foundation of Queen Camilla's title was questionable, what did that mean for those sworn to protect and serve her? As Captain Whitmore prepared for another day of duty, he realized that his simple discovery in the archives had set in motion events that could potentially reshape the modern monarchy. The question was no longer whether he should act on his knowledge, but whether he could live with himself if he didn't. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the very limits of loyalty, duty, and constitutional law within the walls of one of the world's most powerful institutions. The palace corridors buzzed with an unusual tension as Captain Whitmore made his way to the office of Sir Edmund Hartwell, the Lord Chamberlain and head of the royal household. The weight of the ancient document felt heavier in his hands with each step, its revelations burning in his mind like a brand. He had spent sleepless nights wrestling with his conscience, but ultimately, his oath to protect the crown's legal integrity had won over his desire for a quiet life. Sir Edmund was a man in his 70s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of royal politics. When Captain Whitmore requested an urgent private meeting, the Lord Chamberlain's eyebrows rose slightly, but he agreed to see the guard captain immediately. The ornate office, with its portraits of former monarchs gazing down from gilded frames, seemed to hold its breath as Whitmore entered. "Captain Whitmore," Sir Edmund said, gesturing to a chair across from his massive mahogany desk. "You mentioned this was a matter of constitutional importance. That's quite a serious claim for a guardsman to make." His tone was measured, but there was a sharp intelligence in his eyes that suggested he was already calculating the potential implications of whatever Whitmore had brought to him. "Captain." Whitmore placed the leather-bound document on the desk between them, his hand steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "Sir Edmund, I've discovered what appears to be a significant legal irregularity concerning Her Majesty Queen Camilla's title. This document from the Royal Archives suggests that proper, constitutional procedures were not followed during the recent coronation proceedings." The Lord Chamberlain's face remained impassive as he examined the ancient book, but Captain Whitmore noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. Sir Edmund was clearly familiar with the document, which only confirmed Whitmore's growing suspicion that the irregularities were not accidental oversights, but deliberate decisions made at the highest levels of the royal household. "Captain," Sir Edmund said slowly, closing the book and fixing Whitmore with a steady gaze, "these are very serious allegations you're making. Are you absolutely certain you understand the full implications of what you're suggesting?" The question carried an undertone of warning, a subtle reminder of the delicate position Captain Whitmore was placing himself in. "I understand completely, Sir Edmund," Whitmore replied, his voice firm. "I've spent weeks researching these documents, consulting with legal scholars and reviewing historical precedents. The evidence is clear. The constitutional requirements for bestowing the title of Queen Consort were not properly fulfilled. As someone sworn to protect the crown's legal integrity, I cannot remain silent about this matter." The room fell into a heavy silence as Sir Edmund processed the implications. Outside the windows, tourists gathered in the palace courtyard, completely unaware that inside these walls, a constitutional crisis was unfolding that could potentially reshape their understanding of the monarchy they had come to see. Sir Edmund finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Captain Whitmore, I want you to understand something very clearly. The decisions made regarding Her Majesty's title were not made lightly or without extensive consultation with legal experts and constitutional scholars. While I appreciate your diligence in this matter, I would strongly advise you to consider the broader implications of pursuing this line of inquiry." But Captain Whitmore had anticipated this response. He had spent too many years studying royal protocol to be easily dismissed. "With respect, Sir Edmund, if extensive consultation took place, then surely there are documents explaining how these constitutional requirements were satisfied. I would very much like to review those documents to put my concerns to rest." The request hung in the air like a challenge. Sir Edmund's careful composure began to show cracks as he realized that Captain Whitmore was not going to be easily pacified or intimidated. The guard captain had done his homework thoroughly, and his request for documentation was perfectly reasonable under the circumstances. "I'm afraid such documents are classified at the highest levels," Sir Edmund finally replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Matters of this nature are handled by the Privy Council and are not subject to review by palace security personnel." Regardless of their historical knowledge or good intentions, Captain Whitmore felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. The evasive response confirmed what he had begun to suspect. There were no such documents because the proper procedures had never been followed. The coronation had proceeded with full knowledge that constitutional requirements were being bypassed, and now the royal household was hoping that loyalty and tradition would be enough to keep the truth buried. "Sir Edmund," Captain Whitmore said, rising from his chair. "I hope you understand that I cannot simply pretend this conversation never happened. My oath of loyalty extends to the constitutional foundations of the monarchy itself, not just to the individuals who currently occupy royal positions. If these irregularities are not addressed properly, I will have no choice but to bring them to the attention of Parliament and the appropriate legal authorities." The threat was clear, and both men understood its implications. Captain Whitmore was essentially declaring his intention to challenge the legitimacy of Queen Camilla's title through official channels, a move that could trigger a constitutional crisis unlike anything the modern monarchy had ever faced. The loyal guardsman had become a potential revolutionary, armed not with weapons but with ancient laws and an unshakable sense of duty. News of Captain Whitmore's meeting with Sir Edmund spread through the palace like wildfire, carried by whispered conversations in servants' corridors and meaningful glances between courtiers. Within hours, the entire royal household was aware that a constitutional challenge was brewing, one that threatened to expose what many had hoped would remain buried beneath layers of tradition and ceremony. Queen Camilla herself learned of the situation during her afternoon tea, when her private secretary, Margaret Thornfield, hesitantly approached with the disturbing news. The Queen's reaction was one of controlled alarm. She had always known that her path to the throne had been unconventional, but she had trusted that legal experts had properly navigated the constitutional requirements. "Are you telling me," Queen Camilla said, setting down her teacup with deliberate care, "that a palace guard is questioning the legitimacy of my title based on some dusty old book he found in the archives?" Her voice carried the practiced authority of someone who had spent years preparing for royal responsibilities. But beneath the surface, genuine concern was beginning to bloom. Margaret Thornfield, a seasoned courtier who had served the royal family for over 2 decades, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Your Majesty, Captain Whitmore is not just any palace guard. He's widely regarded as one of the most knowledgeable experts on royal protocol within the household. His family has served the crown for generations, and his concerns cannot be easily dismissed as the ramblings of a disgruntled employee." The implications hung heavy in the air. If Captain Whitmore's allegations had merit, it would mean that Queen Camilla's coronation had been conducted under false pretenses, potentially invalidating not just her title, but every official act she had performed as queen consort. The constitutional ramifications could extend far beyond personal embarrassment to create a crisis that might damage the monarchy's credibility for generations. Meanwhile, in the guards' quarters, Captain Whitmore found himself at the center of a growing storm. Some of his fellow guards supported his decision to speak up, viewing him as a principled defender of constitutional law. Others saw him as a dangerous troublemaker whose actions could destabilize the institution they had sworn to protect. The division within the ranks was becoming increasingly apparent. Lieutenant Matthews, whose discovery had started the entire affair, approached Captain Whitmore with additional research that only deepened the constitutional questions. "Sir, I found references to several historical cases where improper titles were challenged and ultimately revoked. In each case, the individuals involved faced serious legal consequences, including potential charges of fraud against the crown." The weight of these historical precedents was not lost on Captain Whitmore. He realized that his actions could potentially lead to criminal charges against Queen Camilla herself, a thought that troubled him deeply despite his commitment to constitutional principles. He had never intended to become the catalyst for such dramatic consequences, but the logic of the law seemed to be driving events beyond his control. As word of the controversy began to leak beyond the palace walls, members of Parliament started asking pointed questions. Several MPs demanded clarification about the constitutional procedures followed during the recent coronation, while others called for a formal investigation into the allegations. The political establishment, already dealing with numerous challenges, found itself facing yet another crisis that threatened to consume valuable time and resources. The media, always hungry for royal scandals, began picking up fragments of the story. Initial reports were vague and speculative, but seasoned royal correspondents recognized the signs of a major story brewing. Phone calls were made to palace sources. Constitutional experts were consulted, and the machinery of modern journalism began grinding into motion. Back in the palace, urgent meetings were being held behind closed doors as senior courtiers attempted to develop a strategy for managing the crisis. Legal advisors were hastily consulted, historical precedents were researched, and contingency plans were drafted for various scenarios. The possibility of a full constitutional review was discussed, along with the potential for parliamentary intervention. King Charles, upon learning of the situation, found himself in an impossible position. Supporting his wife's title meant potentially endorsing constitutional irregularities, while acknowledging the legitimacy of the challenge could undermine the Crown's authority and his own position. The personal and political dimensions of the crisis were becoming increasingly intertwined. Captain Whitmore, aware that his actions had set in motion events far beyond his original intentions, nevertheless remained committed to his course. He had spent too many years believing in the importance of constitutional law to back down now, regardless of the personal or political consequences. The die had been cast and there was no turning back. The palace, once a symbol of stability and tradition, now felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. Every conversation carried the weight of potential consequences. Every decision was analyzed for its implications, and everyone involved understood that they were living through a moment that could reshape the British monarchy forever. The question was no longer whether the crisis could be contained, but how much damage it would inflict before reaching its inevitable conclusion. The morning brought unwelcome news as headlines began appearing in major newspapers across Britain and beyond. Palace Guard challenges. Queen's title screamed the front page of the Daily Telegraph, while The Guardian ran a more measured piece titled, Constitutional Questions Raised Over Coronation Procedures. The story that palace officials had hoped to contain was now spreading across the globe with the unstoppable momentum of modern media. Captain Whitmore arrived at the palace to find himself at the center of a media storm, unlike anything he had ever experienced. Reporters had somehow obtained his photograph and basic biographical information, transforming him overnight from an anonymous guardian into a public figure whose every move was being scrutinized. The weight of public attention was both terrifying and oddly liberating. There was no longer any possibility of quietly resolving the matter behind closed doors. Inside the palace, emergency meetings were being held at the highest levels of government. The Prime Minister, already dealing with economic challenges and international tensions, found his schedule cleared to address what was being called the most serious constitutional crisis in decades. Constitutional lawyers, historians, and parliamentary experts were being consulted as officials scrambled to understand the full implications of Captain Whitmore's allegations. The Archbishop of Canterbury, as the senior religious figure involved in coronation ceremonies, was among those being asked to provide clarity about the constitutional requirements. His statement, carefully worded but ultimately non-committal, did little to quiet the growing storm. Religious leaders, it seemed, were as uncertain about the technical legal requirements as everyone else involved in the controversy. Queen Camilla, maintaining her public composure despite the growing pressure, continued with her scheduled appointments while palace officials worked frantically behind the scenes. Her appearance at a children's hospital opening drew enormous media attention, with reporters analyzing every gesture and expression for signs of stress or concern. The Queen's dignity under pressure impressed many observers, but did nothing to address the underlying constitutional questions. Captain Whitmore, advised by legal experts who had volunteered their services, found himself preparing for what appeared to be an inevitable parliamentary hearing. Members of both the House of Commons and House of Lords were demanding a full investigation into the coronation procedures, with some calling for emergency sessions to address the crisis. The machinery of democratic government was slowly grinding into motion, forcing the monarchy to confront challenges it had hoped to avoid. The international implications of the crisis were becoming increasingly apparent as foreign governments watched the unfolding drama with intense interest. Commonwealth nations, in particular, were concerned about how the controversy might affect their own constitutional arrangements and relationships with the British Crown. Diplomatic cables were flying between London and capitals around the world as officials sought to understand and prepare for potential consequences. Legal scholars began weighing in with increasingly detailed analyses of the constitutional issues involved. Professor Helena Wickham of Oxford University, a leading expert on royal law, published a lengthy paper outlining the historical precedents and legal requirements that appeared to support Captain Whitmore's position. Her conclusion that serious constitutional irregularities appeared to have occurred sent shockwaves through the establishment. Meanwhile, public opinion was beginning to crystallize around the controversy. Polls showed the British public deeply divided, with some supporting Captain Whitmore's principled stand for constitutional law, while others viewed his actions as an attack on the monarchy itself. The generational divide was particularly pronounced, with younger Britons more likely to support constitutional accountability while older citizens tended to prioritize royal tradition and stability. The royal family's response strategy was being coordinated by a team of crisis management experts, constitutional lawyers, and senior courtiers who understood that every decision could have lasting consequences. Initial attempts to dismiss Captain Whitmore's concerns as technical minutiae had failed spectacularly, forcing officials to confront the possibility that substantial changes might be necessary to resolve the crisis. Behind the scenes, frantic efforts were being made to locate additional historical documents that might clarify the constitutional requirements or provide alternative interpretations of existing laws. Teams of researchers were combing through archives, libraries, and private collections in search of anything that might shed new light on the situation. The hope was that some previously overlooked document might provide a legal foundation for Queen Camilla's title that would satisfy constitutional requirements. Captain Whitmore, now accompanied by security guards due to threats from overzealous royal supporters, remained steadfast in his position despite the enormous pressure being applied from multiple directions. Death threats, offers of money to withdraw his allegations, and promises of prestigious positions had all failed to shake his resolve. The simple guardsman had become an unlikely champion of constitutional principle, standing firm against forces that many would have found overwhelming. As the crisis entered its second week, it became clear that no easy resolution was forthcoming. The constitutional questions raised by Captain Whitmore had exposed fundamental weaknesses in the legal foundations of the modern monarchy, weaknesses that decades of tradition and ceremony had successfully concealed until now. The British establishment was being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the gap between constitutional theory and royal practice, truths that threatened to reshape the relationship between the crown and the people it claimed to serve. Parliament convened an emergency session on a grey Thursday morning, with Westminster Hall packed beyond capacity, as members of both houses gathered to address what many were calling the most significant constitutional crisis since the abdication of Edward VIII. The Speaker of the House, recognizing the gravity of the situation, had agreed to allow Captain Whitmore to present his evidence directly to the assembled parliamentarians, a privilege rarely extended to private citizens. Captain Whitmore, dressed in his finest civilian clothes rather than his guard uniform, approached the dispatch box with the steady bearing of a soldier reporting for duty. The weight of history pressed down upon him as he looked out at the faces of elected representatives who held the power to reshape the monarchy with their decisions. In his hands, he carried not just the original documents that had started the crisis, but additional evidence that his legal advisors had helped him compile over the previous weeks. "Honorable members," Captain Whitmore began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber, "I stand before you today not as an enemy of the crown, but as someone sworn to protect its constitutional integrity. The evidence I present challenges not the monarchy itself, but the procedures by which recent coronation ceremonies were conducted." His words were measured and respectful, but their implications hung heavy in the air. As Captain Whitmore methodically presented his evidence, laying out the historical requirements for royal titles and demonstrating how they appeared to have been bypassed, a remarkable transformation occurred in the chamber. Members who had arrived expecting to quickly dismiss the allegations of an overreaching palace guard found themselves confronting detailed legal arguments that were difficult to refute. The ancient documents spoke with an authority that transcended political party lines and personal loyalties. Sir Geoffrey Hartington, the longest-serving member of Parliament and widely regarded as the institution's leading expert on constitutional law, rose to ask the first question. "Captain Whitmore, you allege that proper parliamentary consultation was not sought before bestowing the title of Queen Consort. Can you explain what form such consultation should have taken, according to historical precedent?" The question allowed Captain Whitmore to demonstrate the depth of his research. He cited specific examples from previous centuries, outlining the detailed procedures that had been followed when similar titles were granted. His responses revealed not just extensive knowledge, but a genuine respect for constitutional traditions that impressed even his critics. This was clearly not the action of someone seeking personal glory or attempting to damage the monarchy for political purposes. Queen Camilla, watching the proceedings from a private room in Buckingham Palace, felt the walls of her world slowly closing in around her. The captain's presentation was devastating in its thoroughness and impossible to dismiss as the work of a crank or troublemaker. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, creating an increasingly compelling case that her title rested on constitutionally questionable foundations. The parliamentary debate that followed Captain Whitmore's presentation revealed deep divisions within the political establishment. Conservative members argued passionately for the importance of royal tradition and warned against the dangers of retroactive constitutional challenges. Liberal and Labor members countered with equally passionate speeches about the rule of law and the principle that no institution, regardless of its historical importance, could be above constitutional requirements. Lord Chancellor William Pemberton, representing the government's position, attempted to thread the needle between competing concerns. While we respect Captain Whitmore's diligence in raising these constitutional questions, he told the assembled members, we must also consider the practical implications of undoing coronation ceremonies that have already taken place. The stability of our constitutional monarchy depends on balancing legal precision with practical governance. But Captain Whitmore's legal advisors had anticipated this argument. Professor Margaret Thornfield, the constitutional scholar who had volunteered to represent him, rose to address the chamber. My lords and members, constitutional law does not provide exemptions for convenience or tradition. If we accept that coronation ceremonies can proceed without proper legal foundations, simply because they have already occurred, we establish a dangerous precedent that undermines the very concept of constitutional government. The debate continued for hours, with speakers from all parties weighing in on the implications of the crisis. Some argued for immediate action to revoke Queen Camilla's title until proper procedures could be followed, while others proposed legislative solutions that would retroactively validate the coronation while establishing clearer procedures for the future. The complexity of the constitutional issues involved made simple solutions impossible. Outside Westminster, massive crowds had gathered as news of the parliamentary session spread. Royal supporters held signs defending Queen Camilla and denouncing Captain Whitmore as a traitor, while constitutional activists praised him as a hero standing up for the rule of law. Police struggled to maintain order as the two groups faced off across barriers, their chants and slogans reflecting the deep divisions the crisis had exposed within British society. International media coverage reached fever pitch as constitutional experts from around the world weighed in on the controversy. American legal scholars drew parallels to their own constitutional crises, while European commentators analyzed the implications for other constitutional monarchies. The crisis had transcended national boundaries to become a global discussion about the relationship between traditional institutions and modern legal requirements. As the parliamentary session drew to a close, it became clear that no immediate resolution would be forthcoming. The Speaker announced that a special constitutional committee would be established to thoroughly investigate the issues raised by Captain Whitmore and to propose solutions that would satisfy both legal requirements and practical governance needs. The committee would have unprecedented access to royal archives and the power to compel testimony from all parties involved in the coronation ceremonies. Captain Whitmore left Westminster knowing that he had achieved his primary objective. The constitutional issues he had discovered would now receive the thorough examination they deserved. But he also understood that the process he had set in motion would likely take months or even years to reach its conclusion, during which time the monarchy would operate under a cloud of constitutional uncertainty that could have profound implications for its future role in British society. The Special Constitutional Committee began its work amid unprecedented public scrutiny, with every hearing broadcast live and analyzed by teams of experts on television networks around the world. Committee Chairman Lord Justice Patricia Blackwood, a respected jurist known for her meticulous attention to legal detail, made it clear from the outset that no stone would be left unturned in examining the constitutional issues surrounding Queen Camilla's title. The committee's first major witness was Sir Edmund Hartwell, the Lord Chamberlain, whose earlier meeting with Captain Whitmore had failed to resolve the crisis. Under oath and facing skilled legal questioning, Sir Edmund's carefully constructed defenses began to crumble. When asked directly whether proper constitutional procedures had been followed during the coronation, his evasive responses only strengthened suspicions that corner-cutting had indeed occurred. "Sir Edmund," Lord Justice Blackwood pressed, "you have stated that extensive legal consultation took place before the coronation ceremonies. Can you provide this committee with documentation of those consultations, including the legal opinions rendered and the constitutional authorities cited?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Sir Edmund's response was a masterpiece of bureaucratic evasion. He spoke of verbal consultations, informal advisory sessions, and the collective wisdom of experienced courtiers, but could produce no written documentation of the legal analysis that supposedly supported the controversial title. Each non-answer only deepened the committee's skepticism and strengthened Captain Whitmore's position. The committee's investigation soon uncovered a disturbing pattern of shortcuts and assumptions that had characterized the coronation planning process. Multiple witnesses testified that concerns about constitutional requirements had been raised during planning meetings, only to be dismissed by senior officials who prioritized ceremony over legal precision. The picture that emerged was of a royal household more concerned with public spectacle than constitutional compliance. Queen Camilla herself was eventually called to testify, a development that sent shockwaves through the British establishment. Never before had a reigning queen consort been required to appear before a parliamentary committee to defend the legitimacy of her own title. The unprecedented nature of the hearing only underscored the gravity of the constitutional crisis that Captain Whitmore's discovery had unleashed. The Queen's testimony was dignified but ultimately damaging to her position. While she maintained that she had relied on the advice of constitutional experts and royal officials, she was forced to admit that she had not personally reviewed the legal requirements for her title or demanded documentation of their fulfillment. Her trust in others' expertise, while understandable, left her vulnerable to charges that she had been negligent in ensuring proper constitutional procedures were followed. Captain Whitmore's own testimony before the committee was a tour de force of constitutional scholarship and personal conviction. Over the course of 6 hours, he methodically walked the committee through his research, explaining each document and its significance with the precision of an academic and the passion of a true believer. His presentation left little doubt that serious constitutional irregularities had occurred. The committee also heard from leading constitutional scholars from universities across Britain and the Commonwealth. Their testimony was overwhelmingly supportive of Captain Whitmore's position, with expert after expert confirming that the historical requirements for royal titles had not been properly observed. The academic consensus was so strong that even the monarchy's defenders were forced to acknowledge the validity of the constitutional concerns that had been raised. Public opinion continued to evolve as the committee's hearings progressed. Polls showed growing support for Captain Whitmore's position, particularly among younger Britons who viewed the crisis as an opportunity to modernize and democratize the monarchy. Older citizens remained more supportive of Queen Camilla, but even among royal traditionalists, concerns about constitutional compliance were beginning to take hold. The international implications of the crisis continued to multiply as Commonwealth nations grappled with the potential consequences for their own constitutional arrangements. Several countries began reviewing their own procedures for recognizing royal titles, while others questioned whether the controversy might provide an opportunity to reduce their constitutional ties to the British Crown. The crisis that had begun in a dusty palace archive was reshaping relationships across the globe. Media coverage of the committee hearings revealed the deep complexity of constitutional monarchy in the modern world. Legal experts struggled to explain arcane procedures and historical precedents to confused audiences, while political commentators debated the broader implications for British democracy. The crisis had become a teaching moment about the often overlooked legal foundations of traditional institutions. Behind the scenes, frantic negotiations were taking place as palace officials and government representatives sought to find a face-saving solution to the crisis. Various proposals were floated, from retroactive parliamentary approval of Queen Camilla's title to more dramatic reforms that would modernize royal succession and title procedures. But each potential solution raised new constitutional questions and political complications. The committee's investigation also revealed the personal toll that the crisis had taken on all involved parties. Captain Whitmore, despite his public vindication, struggled with the knowledge that his actions had caused enormous stress to people he genuinely respected. Queen Camilla, maintaining her dignity under impossible circumstances, privately questioned whether her lifelong dream of serving the crown was worth the constitutional chaos it had unleashed. As the committee prepared to release its preliminary findings, the entire British establishment held its breath. The nation that had given the world the concept of constitutional monarchy was about to learn whether its own institutions could adapt to the demands of modern legal accountability. The answer would determine not just Queen Camilla's fate, but the future relationship between tradition and law in one of the world's oldest democracies. The morning of the committee's final report arrived with an unusual stillness hanging over London, as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for the verdict that would reshape the British monarchy. Lord Justice Blackwood, flanked by her fellow committee members, approached the podium in Westminster Hall with the gravity befitting someone about to deliver one of the most consequential constitutional rulings in modern British history. After extensive investigation and careful consideration of all evidence presented, Lord Justice Blackwood began, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed chamber. This committee has reached unanimous conclusions regarding the constitutional issues raised by Captain James Whitmore concerning the title of Her Majesty Queen Camilla. The pause that followed seemed to stretch for eternity as the assembled crowd waited to learn the fate of the monarchy. We find that Captain Whitmore's allegations are substantially correct, the Lord Justice continued, sending ripples of shock through the chamber. The constitutional requirements for bestowing the title of Queen Consort were not properly fulfilled during the recent coronation ceremonies. While we acknowledge that these oversights appear to have been inadvertent rather than deliberate, constitutional law does not provide exceptions for well-intentioned mistakes. The committee's report outlined a series of recommendations designed to resolve the crisis while preserving the stability of the monarchy. Rather than simply revoking Queen Camilla's title, they proposed an unprecedented solution: retroactive parliamentary approval coupled with immediate reforms to prevent similar constitutional irregularities in the future. The proposal represented a delicate balance between legal precision and practical governance. Queen Camilla's response to the committee's findings surprised many observers with its grace and constitutional awareness. In a carefully worded statement, she acknowledged the validity of the concerns raised and expressed her willingness to undergo whatever procedures were necessary to ensure her title rested on solid constitutional foundations. Her dignified acceptance of the committee's findings helped to diffuse much of the political tension surrounding the crisis. The parliamentary vote on the committee's recommendations took place 3 weeks later, with members of both houses gathering to make what many considered the most important constitutional decision of their careers. The debate was intense but respectful, with speakers from all parties acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the situation and the need for a solution that would strengthen, rather than weaken, British constitutional traditions. The final vote was closer than many had predicted, but the committee's recommendations were ultimately approved by substantial majorities in both houses. Queen Camilla's title was retroactively validated through proper parliamentary procedures, while new laws were enacted requiring explicit parliamentary approval for all future royal titles. The monarchy had been modernized through crisis, emerging with stronger constitutional foundations than it had possessed in centuries. Captain Whitmore, vindicated by the parliamentary vote, but exhausted by months of public scrutiny, returned to his duties as a palace guard with a new understanding of the power of individual conscience in constitutional government. His actions had proven that even traditional institutions must answer to the law, and that ordinary citizens could hold extraordinary power when they acted with courage and conviction. The international implications of the crisis continued to unfold in the months following the parliamentary resolution. Several Commonwealth nations used the British experience as a catalyst for their own constitutional reforms, while others began the process of reducing their formal ties to the crown. The crisis that had begun with a dusty book in a palace archive had triggered a global Reassessment of constitutional monarchy in the modern world. Queen Camilla's reign, initially clouded by constitutional controversy, gradually gained new legitimacy through her graceful handling of the crisis and her active support for the constitutional reforms it had inspired. Public opinion polls showed growing respect for her willingness to subject herself to parliamentary scrutiny, with many citizens viewing her actions as evidence of the monarchy's ability to adapt to democratic expectations. The reforms enacted in response to the crisis extended far beyond royal titles to encompass broader questions of constitutional accountability and transparency. New laws required parliamentary oversight of major royal ceremonies, while freedom of information legislation was expanded to include previously secret palace archives. The British Constitution had been strengthened through crisis, emerging more democratic and accountable than ever before. Years later, constitutional scholars would point to the Whitmore crisis as a turning point in the evolution of British democracy, a moment when ancient institutions proved their ability to adapt to modern legal requirements without losing their essential character. The simple palace guard who had discovered an obscure legal requirement had unleashed forces of constitutional change that would shape the monarchy for generations to come. Captain Whitmore himself rarely spoke publicly about his role in the crisis, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. When pressed by historians and journalists seeking to understand his motivations, he would simply say that he had done what his oath required, protecting the constitutional foundations upon which the Crown's authority ultimately rested. His principled stand had reminded the world that in a constitutional democracy, no institution could be above the law. The legacy of the crisis lived on in the strengthened constitutional procedures it had created and in the precedent it had established for individual accountability in matters of constitutional law. The British monarchy, tested by fire, had emerged more democratic, more transparent, and more firmly grounded in legal principle than at any point in its long history. The price of that transformation had been high, but the result was a constitutional system worthy of the democratic society it served.